There's one very simple thing that we need to do to gain a lot of spiritual happiness and peace and move towards liberation, and that is to see our mental formations as empty, void, dependently arisen, and not to be caught up by them and take them seriously. I see this again and again, people caught in mental formations and causing themselves a great deal of suffering. See it often in the case of people who leave a meditation retreat early. It's generally they're chased out by their own mental formations. Something begins percolating in their mind and they take it seriously and they feel they have to go and tend to business right now. You know? And very often, as soon as the person stops meditating, they realize, oh, that was just a bit of nonsense. Where'd that come from? You know? So what are these mental formations and what function are they and why are they troublesome? Mental formations are sankharas in Pali. For those on the book study, Tenisaro's translation is fabrications, referring to the same thing. Formation or fabrication are both probably equally valid. The name sankhara means something compounded, something built up. The verbal root is karoti, to make or do, and sang is a prefix that means together with. So it's things that the mind cobbles together. It's one of the 5 aggregates. It's a normal and essential part of the mental equipment. And sankhara is used properly in their proper place are essential. You know, we couldn't function in the world without mental formations, without thinking. One of the characteristics of an arahant is that he or she thinks only what he or she wants to think and does not think what he does not want to think. An arahant is a master of the pathways of the mind. So it's not the case that an arahant has no sankharas, but he would only have those sankharas that he wishes or wills to have. And you can think easily of how useful the sankharas are. We have to think and plan and organize, and we do these things with the mind. But where it becomes problematic is that, not being arahants, we are not fully masters of the pathways of the mind. The mental constructions often easily run away with us. And this is especially the case when you're trying to quiet the mind, when you're trying to meditate. It takes some diligent practice and persistence to tame the mind, to train the mind. The mind is used to having its head, to running loose. It's like an analogy given by the Buddha, taken from his background in the Indian warrior caste, is how they train a wild elephant for the royal service. They get a wild elephant and they chain it to a post with a long length of chain and leave it. And the elephant will rampage and roar and try and break loose and be completely unruly. After a while, it settles down from doing that and just paces around in a circle around the post. And then finally it goes and lies down beside the post. And then they can take the chain off and begin training the elephant. It's now domesticated for the royal service. And he says this analogy is like the mind. You try to train the mind. The post is the object of meditation, the breath or the kasina or whatever the contemplation may be. And the chain is mindfulness. And as long as you initially keep the mind chained to the meditation object, even if it roars and rampages and runs around, you can't get too far away. You keep returning it to the point of contemplation. And eventually it will settle by stages into being completely at peace with the object of meditation. This is stilling the sankharas. A related concept, a particular kind of sankhara, is papancha, which is proliferation. And papancha is how the mind from an initial seed, if it's unchecked, it can flourish and go into all kinds of sidelines and digressions, diversions, and create a whole elaborate Baroque structure from an initial seed, an initial thought. If the mindfulness is very good, when meditating, you notice the mental formations as they first occur, then you don't have to follow them. The particular place of thought in the mental landscape has a kind of a two-sided appearance. On the one hand, it is something that we do. It's always accompanied. One of the universal mental characteristics is mental factors is cetana, is a volition. So there is some volition behind every thought. There is some will, which is why there is karma associated with thought. In fact, all karma actually originates in the mind. It's only actions that are done with volition that have karmic force. The classic example is stepping on a beetle in the dark. There's no karma associated with that because it's not done with any volition. There's no action you can do with the body or mind that doesn't originate first in the mind. And we make karma with speech and action, but also with mind, and it originates always in the mind. So the mental formations have an aspect of volition. It doesn't seem like that at times when you're struggling in meditation with the monkey mind, and the mind's running all over with all kinds of odd thoughts and won't be quiet. That's because you have not mastered the skill of using the volition to control the mind. There's very little volition being used, being exercised at that point. You're not taking control of the situation. The mind is being allowed to run. And this is fed by the defilements. It's fed by greed, by fear, by ill will, by delusion. The thought is double-sided. The other side is thought as an object, which is equally important to understand, that from the point of view of consciousness, from the point of view of the citta, the knowing mind, thought is not something done. It's not done by that aspect of mind. It's only seen, it's known, it's an object. And if you can master the trick of centering yourself in the knowing mind, then it all falls into place. If the citta is just watching the thoughts, they will settle on their own because they're not being fed. You're not getting involved in them. Ajahn Chah once, one of his aphorisms was that the best way to kill a tiger is to starve it to death. Or the safest way to kill a tiger is to starve it to death. You don't feed the mental formations if you don't want them. Whenever you're caught in something, the mind's running around on some scheme or anxiety or desire, repeating itself, obsessing the mind, it's because you're feeding it. You're taking some interest in it. And perversely, this can even be a negative interest. If you're allowing yourself to get upset by the thinking process, you can get caught in it more. In dealing with the mental formations in meditation, there's always the distinction between what kind of meditation you're doing, whether you're doing at that time, whether you're doing samatha or vipassana. And then we treat these objects in an opposite way. This is really the distinction between the two forms of meditation. If you're doing insight or vipassana, you want to see the object but not get involved in it. So you learn a particular kind of attention. Sometimes vipassana or insight is translated as investigation, and that's got some merit, but it can be misleading as well, because it's not an investigation in the sense of trying to figure anything out. It's trying to know things directly in that moment as they actually are. So the mental formation is seen just as a mental formation. And one of the phrases that comes from one of the modern teachers that I think is very useful is that one should pay attention to the process, not the content. It's not what you're thinking about that's important. It's just the fact that you're thinking, to see the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of how that works. This is seeing it with insight. And with insight meditation, vipassana, remember the rule also that nothing is too trivial to miss, but nothing is so important that it has to be held. This is a characteristic of equanimity, the middleness about that applied to the objects, that each object is treated with the same weight and it's just seen as a process and let go. If you're doing a samatha meditation, the mental formations are treated differently. The practice here is non-attention. You disregard them and try to keep your consciousness stable on the object of meditation. And remember that samadhi, which is the prime quality you develop with samatha meditation, samadhi is explained as stability or stillness. We're not narrowing the mind. You're not trying to screen things out. You're trying to keep the mind still so it doesn't wander. The elephant is lying down beside the post. So when other objects arise, we just disregard them. The mind will, for a long time, still keep throwing up formations, and you just disregard them. This is generally considered to be, for most people, is an easier meditation than vipassana. That's why the traditional progress of teaching in the suttas and in the traditional form is to begin with samatha before taking up vipassana. We find often with meditators in the West, many of them come from a background where they have learned meditation first in the vipassana form, either the Goenka style or the Mahasi style, and they often find it very difficult to take up samatha initially. Eventually they can get over it, but the difficulty they encounter is what is actually, for someone who's starting with it, it's fairly straightforward, is the idea of disregarding or non-attention, the art of non-attention. Because they've been told to pay attention to every mental event, which is correct in the vipassana, but it will just bog you down, block your progress if you keep falling back into that when you're trying to do samatha. You have to learn the art of non-attention, of disregarding the formations, letting them settle by themselves in the background. Keep bringing the object of meditation to the forefront of consciousness. And there are practices that you can usefully take up where you use mental formations as a form of contemplation, as directed thinking. There's many of them listed in the Visuddhimagga, the contemplation of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, of devas, of virtue, contemplation of the repulsiveness of nutriment, contemplation of death. All these are kind of a meditation where you're using directed thought to contemplate some particular aspect of Dhamma. And there are variations of this too, using thinking. Often it works well with walking meditation. Take some particular teaching that you want to think about, contemplate, or gain a greater depth of understanding. Something like dependent origination, or the five aggregates, or eightfold path, and something that's easily broken up into factors, and contemplate them, think about them as you're deliberately kind of asking yourself questions about it and trying to work it out. This kind of directed thought that can be used in a Dhamma, for progress in Dhamma. So don't make the mistake of thinking sankharas are bad and no sankharas are good. This is too simplistic. For the right purpose and under control and at the right time, sankharas are very positive and useful. But when they're not well disciplined, then when they're running wild, the elephant is raging, then it can cause you not only a distraction, but can cause you actual suffering. And people suffer a great deal because of their own mental formations. And there's even like psychiatric disorders that are essentially classified, things like obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety attacks, depression. These are all the result of mental formations. These are mental formations gone awry in one way or another. And everyone who's not yet an arahant will suffer to some degree from this sort of unchecked mental formations. The only perfectly sane individuals are arahants. The rest of us have some degree of trouble. Now, talking about unchecked mental formations and insanity, yeah. And this can be actually kind of exaggerated in meditation, and particularly on a longer retreat. It's one of the sort of traps, is getting caught in your own sort of circular mental formations. It doesn't only apply to meditation. It happens, all the time. We get caught in these things. There's a Thai story of one of the Ajahns tells the story, but it's like a traditional Thai story. There's a fellow learns that eggs cost 5 baht a dozen in his village, but there's another village a moderate distance away where they're selling for 8 baht a dozen. So he thinks, well, that's the way I can make some money. So he buys up all the eggs he can in the village, and he carefully packs them in a sack and carries them, and he's walking towards this other village, and he's going to sell them. And halfway there, he stops for a rest under a tree, and he's thinking, boy, this is going to be great. I'm gonna make all this money. Then I'll go back to my village and buy more eggs, and then maybe I'll have to buy a cart to carry them in. And then I'll have maybe I'll get some guys to work for me, and we can just keep running eggs around the countryside looking for where they're get the best price. And pretty soon I'll have enough money. I'll be able to buy some land, and I'll have a nice house, and I'm sure I'll get a pretty wife when I've got all that stuff. And then the wife will start nagging me, and she'll tell me to work harder, and he gets angry at his imaginary wife, and he lashes out his leg to kick her, and he breaks all the eggs. He kicks the sack. This is like the mental formations running away and playing havoc with your life. And in meditation we can get caught in all these kind of elaborate, because you're trying to quiet the mind. The mind doesn't want to be quiet, so it'll throw up all these formations. And as I said, their seed is the defilements. They're either greed. You're running off into various fantasies about all this wonderful things you're going to do when you get out of retreat, or anxiety and fear. You're thinking of various dangers and horrible things, and maybe I should go home right now. I can't remember if I left the stove on or health. People get obsessed and worried about their health, every little ache and pain and itch, and so, God, it's that cancer. And then the mind can't let that go. There was one young guy here years ago who he was on a retreat. He came and told me that he had to go to the hospital. He had a bad bellyache. And I knew it was in his head. And I couldn't convince him, and he says, maybe it's appendicitis. I made the mistake. I had a medical book, and I looked up appendicitis, and I started reading. I shouldn't have done this. I started reading it out, and, oh yeah, I've got that. Like every symptom, right? So then he goes into town, and they check him out thoroughly at the hospital. They can't find anything physically wrong, but he told me later, like the doctor was kind of puzzled because there's nothing physically wrong, but I've got to describe every symptom exactly of appendicitis. So they told him, well, you better stay in town so you're close to get to the emergency if you have to. So that was the end of his retreat. But this is mental formation. This is one of the ways mental formation runs away with you. Or delusion. You can get all kinds of strange ideas take over the mind. There was another fellow here who told me he was staying in a tent. We had like a group retreat going, and he was staying in a tent. And he told me that he was really having trouble with fear. And I said, well, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of animals? Which is kind of it's not, we don't really have so much dangerous animals here, but it is sort of a rational fear. So, the fear of wild animals. But just no, I just keep thinking that if there are UFOs abducting people, there's kind of remote places like this. And he worked himself up into the fear that he was going to be abducted by aliens. Yeah, whatever happened to that guy? So, anything, all of these kind of mental formations can ruin your meditation at the least, or also can cause you a great deal of suffering and turmoil. And really, as I started at the beginning to say, is the simple key is just don't take it seriously. It's useful if you can develop a sense of humor about your own foibles, your mental states. It's just that again, it's that ridiculous nonsense. Don't take it seriously. Don't allow yourself to invest any importance in it. It helps once you're able to really see the mental formations as empty, as void. Intellectually, it's not hard to grasp that concept. There's nothing there. It's just a fabric of the mind. It's just a shadow. It's just a magic play of the mind. But to really grasp that essentially, to to know that as a reality. It takes some practice of really seeing it, because you keep it caught again and again. But you see, oh, it's just empty. It's just dependently arisen. There's nothing there. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be concerned about. There's nothing to be excited about. It's just a mental formation. Just let it go. Just let it settle. If they're not invested in, if they're not taken as important, if they're not fed any energy, they'll settle away. They'll go away on their own. They only persist if you're in some way feeding them. You know? It's a common metaphor. Is like a stray dog that comes around. If you ignore it, it'll yap around your heels a little bit and run off looking for better prospects. But if you feed it or pet it, or you can't get rid of it. It'll hang around and hang around. So you have to watch that you're not feeding the mental formations. And to reiterate, the Samatha method is just disregarding them, letting them settle on their own. Put them in the background. Don't pay them any attention. Just ignore them. The art of non-attention. The Vipassana method is more difficult, but it's more powerful in the sense that you're putting an end to them, is seeing them in the correct way, which is with dispassion, with clarity, and without getting interested in them or taking them up as an object of fear or fascination, just as this object that's in the mind, just knowing it, penetrating its nature, which in the end means seeing it as empty. This is just an empty object in the mind. I don't have to invest in it. I don't have to believe in it.